Okay, so here we go. This is a lightning round, and the lightning round is relative to a forecast over the next several years in certain industry sectors, and you could relate to that equipment. So, first one, Peter, we talked about this the supply chain as it relates to, let's call it anything distribution related, anything in the distribution plants, forklifts, conveyors, um, shipping equipment. So, it also then relates to over the road truck trailer across the country, rail, inland marine. Talk about transportation with
Sure.
exclusion of aircraft.
Well, automotive and trucking was the first sector to start the relocation from China, and they were also the ones that had their biggest footprint in the Texas-Mexico axis. So it's looking stronger and stronger and stronger, and is only going to improve. But when you get into heavier equipment, almost all of that picked up and relocated to China over the course of the last 20 years. But the new NAFTA is going to force it all back. So all of that industrial plant that's been moved over there, complete loss. And the companies that are now going to have to rebuild their capacity, probably in Texas, the Midwest, and Mexico, are going to have to do from scratch. You're not going to do that in 6 months. Everybody doesn't need a forklift, so you don't get the same economies of scale from the manufacturing system. It's coming back. It's probably going to start very big build outs in 2021. Marine, I'm a big water guy. It's the cheapest and most efficient way to move things from A to B. But the dumbest law in the history of the United States is the Jones Act. And it basically says that anything that's transported between two American ports has to be American built, captained, crewed, and owned. It's been in place for a century, and in the time that the Jones Act has been in existence, the amount of cargo that has been transported on the American waterway network has dropped by 99%. Neither Trump nor Biden want to do away or amend the Jones Act because the unions love it, and that is now a political faction that is in play. So I do not expect any significant changes going on in the marine space for the next couple of years.
How about rail?
Sorry?
Rail.
Rail. Uh, when it comes to the manufacturing, that's pretty straightforward. And there is probably sufficient rolling stock right now. The industry still needs to go through a little bit of a consolidation. And we knew this was going to happen. Doesn't have anything to do with the COVID or the recession or anything. We knew it was going to happen because the shale sector has been building out pipelines. And with every pipeline that is built, that is one fewer mass of rail cars that you need. So we probably right now actually have a little bit of overcapacity. Nothing dangerous, but something that will put some slack in the market for the next year or two.
Okay. Let's talk about. We talked about this already a couple times, but the manufacturing. We talked about the manufacturing is going to come into maybe Mexico, maybe southern U.S., Midwest. Do we see heavy manufacturing coming, the stuff that was done in China, or is it all more technology manufacturing, making iPhones? I mean, technology.
Well, earlier I was specifically speaking of heavy equipment, whether it's farm equipment, construction equipment, inventory and equipment, mining equipment, that sort of stuff. That's the one that has to come back because of the new NAFTA. In terms of other kinds of manufacturing, we already talked about automotive. We're going to see wiring and textile come back because the U.S. has the lowest price point for the power that is necessary to make those things work. We're seeing electronics come back in a very big way with the border communities between the United States and Mexico probably grabbing most of that. Semiconductors get a little weird. The United States and Mexico, based on whether United fingers or eyes, is already raking back all the assembly facilities. But the superconductor fab facilities where you create the crystals and cut them into semiconductors and build them into chips, that's going to be a little bit slower simply because the entire process is done at one facility. They're multi-billion dollar facilities. You don't move those if you have no choice. So what's been happening is the Asian manufacturers in this space, they look at their future revenue expectations, and all the new facilities are already coming here. But what we're probably going to see at some point in 2021 is some of the pre-existing ones starting to move. Now, those things take 2, 3, 4 years to build. Phoenix has already got two, one that's under construction and one that's about to start. And we're going to get at least another half a dozen, but 8 is probably enough for the country. Now, once that is done, then you can start talking about a whole scale rearrangement of how Silicon Valley does its business. But the road from here to there for Silicon Valley is way rocky. They have no friends in Washington anymore, and their entire supply chain system is on another continent. There's no way that that ends well.
Okay. Oil and gas. That supplied a lot of activity for U.S. manufacturers, equipment finance companies for a good 5 to 10 years prior to the price of oil going below $40 a barrel. What's your thoughts going forward? If we bring more of this stuff in, we're gonna need more energy.
There's good and bad. Strategically, the picture's great. One of the things we saw with coronavirus and that temporary price blip that went negative back in the first part of the year was it anyone who was dependent on cash flow died. So we've seen consolidation in that industry with a lot of the bigger players picking up the smaller players' work. Now, the bigger players have better cash flow. They don't need to live hand to mouth, and so they will only drill the better parts of the plots. And if when they're finished drilling and fracking, if oil prices are not where they want them, they just cap them and wait. Well, that gives us a frac log of like 1 million barrels a day. So, call that a national reserve, call that stored supply, whatever you're going to call it. It does mean that we're going to have less activity in that space because it's not necessary. When you have bigger players, you get wells that are producing, 1 to 10,000 barrels a day instead of 100 to 1,000. And if you have 1/10 the number of wells, you need 1/10 the number of drilling crews. And so it's not that the industry has become less productive, it's become more productive, but it's become productive with less staff and less money. And if you are in the business of supplying that industry, the heyday's over. We're never going back. We're just too productive for it now. So the U.S. is going to be net oil independent again, probably within 2 or 3 months. And then we've got 1 million barrels a day stored up in capacity where you just have to turn a valve and let it go. We got a lot of good news in the last year in the energy sector. Like, for example, when we had those negative prices, a lot of producers shut in their production. We had never done that with shale before. We didn't know if it was going to damage the reservoirs. We didn't know if it would ever come back on. And when people then turned the valves to open it up again, they found out they had more pressure than when they closed them. So, a lot of good news, unless you're supplying equipment to the industry, and then they just don't need as much.
Got it.
Or they can do it in house because it's bigger players.
Talk about a big energy consumer. Commercial aircraft, we've talked about, the people aren't going to fly for some time still. They're not going to be comfortable. What does that do to corporate aircraft? We're seeing anecdotal evidence that the corporate aircraft market has picked up, and that includes places like NetJets and all those, fractional ownership kind of projects. You got any feel about that? Is that just going to continue on that way as people still got to fly and have to fly and corporations still need to move or not?
I'm a heavy business traveler. In calendar year 2019, I spent 270 days traveling. This year, not so much. But I see why. If you're an exec, if you've got a lot of disposable income, if you have to be there right now, uh, corporate jets are largely immune to the health concerns that happen in normal aircraft. And so people who are on the verge of going that direction are now going to go that direction. And the people who are already in that world aren't going to stop. So the idea at the absolute top level will actually see a little more demand. That makes sense. But business travel for normal people, that's never going to pick back up, or at least not in the next 3 years, which means that the 20% of the passengers that generate 80% of the revenue for the airlines, they're just gone. And until we have such a time that the vaccine is widely distributed, tourism income is not going to come back. And remember that half of tourism income is from people who are retired. And anyone who retired in calendar year 2017 to 2023 has now had a huge melon scoop of their income and savings taken away by coronavirus. So, we're talking years till that comes back, even if the global system holds together. Now, if you're caring about the equipment, the story's probably going to be a little bit different. The Trump administration was willing to go to the wall with the Canadians over aerospace. And in an environment of less travel, The only way that airlines survive is with extreme subsidization. And the Europeans are going to have to subsidize way more than Americans are because theirs were all underwater even before coronavirus hit. And Airbus has decided, I guess all these new airlines that we subsidize, or sorry, these new airframe designs aren't going to work. So America, yes, we spent $20 billion in launch subsidies on all these, but we're going to stop now. So you don't have to sue us anymore. No, that's not how that works. So this is one of those things that's leading towards a U.S.-European trade war. There is no way that Airbus survives this. So the aerospace pie is going to shrink, but Airbus is unlikely to survive as a significant player moving forward. It's going to get killed by coronavirus. It's going to get killed by the trade war. Assuming the European Union doesn't hold together, then it's dead, and Brexit takes away the engines and the wings, which I think they need.
All right, we're going to go on. IT and software. I think we saw they were the beneficiary during COVID. Where does that go from here?
In terms of equipment and coding in order to connect everybody better, yeah, that story has a ways to run. But when you're talking the equipment itself, it's all from Asia, mostly from China, and that is going to stop. So how quickly that industry can pivot is going to be the issue. Now, when it comes to connections, cellular routers, all that good stuff, that kind of falls in the electronics bucket. It's really not all that sophisticated. So it's probably going to bounce back quicker. But telephony and computing, that's the complex stuff. That's the place where the supply chain really is under threat.
Okay. Construction, both
Depends on what
residential
you're
and
into.
commercial. What's that?
If you're doing residential, people are relocating. And if you're doing construction for residential in the south, the west, or the southwest, the places that are relatively light on snow, have elbow room, so labor costs, and I'm sorry, have elbow room, so land costs are low. And so you can build out rather than up. Those are the boom cities. Denver, Phoenix, the Texas cities, the cities of the South, maybe Salt Lake, those all look great. Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, they're not going to bounce back in the next decade because we have a hollowing out of those cities. We have a hollowing out of the tax base as everyone wants to move to a place that is cheaper and or warmer. In commercial real estate, same basic pattern. I mean, we're even seeing financial sector starting to move out of New York in a very big way. And any place that they move is going to be one of those cities in the South, the West, or the Southwest. So you can have wild price inflation and housing shortages in those cities, and then price deflation and decrepit real estate in the older cities. And that split is going to define American internal development patterns for at least the next 5 years.
Got it. And the last one, not necessarily in the equipment category, but small business versus large corporates. Over the next 3 years, as all this is in flux on the supply chain and trade, what are your impressions of small business? Does it become bigger because more companies are reducing people, and those people will then go out and start their own businesses? What do you think about corporate and small business?
I think it'll be split. In the manufacturing space, I expect the smaller companies to do very, very well. If you look at the automotive platforms from Oklahoma City down through Texas into northern Mexico, there are very few large companies that dominate at all. It's dozens, if not hundreds, of smaller companies that deal with independent parts of the supply chain that they do well, often in partnership with local machine shops. I expect that model to explode, particularly into the electronics space. On the flip side, the federal government is not good at helping the little guy, but they're very good at pushing money out, which helps the big companies. So I think that while we're in the manufacturing space, we're going to see more and smaller. In every other sector, we're probably going to see fewer and bigger.
Got it. Well, that pretty much covers all of the areas that we wanted to cover. And thank you for your time on these ones. I didn't really know, as a geopolitical expert, how we were going to transition and get into these various sectors, but you did a very good job. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.